Hi, and welcome to CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month here on CityWorks, we examine an aspect of the lives of working people, our work, our rights, our power, our stories. Our program today looks at transgender people and some significant recent wins at the national, state, and city level. In Washington, the Biden administration has announced that the Department of Health and Human Services will once again prohibit discrimination against people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. That reverses a Trump administration decree that created an exception to the anti discrimination provisions of the Affordable Care Act just for people who are trans. President Biden's also pledged his support for expanding our federal civil rights laws. We'll talk more about that. In another win in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed a bill this February that repeals a state anti-loitering law, commonly called the Walking While Trans ban. That law, the evidence showed, police were invoking disproportionately to harass and arrest trans women, especially young trans women of color. Finally, in Manhattan, the district attorney's office has announced that it will no longer prosecute sex workers. This is huge for a whole class of vulnerable workers who've been vilified, criminalized, marginalized, and incarcerated for what many call survival crimes. Advocates are calling this the kind of change our community's been hoping for and advocating for decades. So, what does all of this mean for trans workers, LGBTQ people, their co-workers, and everyone in this country? And what do these wins teach about organizing, community building, and the work, and dare we say love, that goes into that? For this Pride Month special, I'm joined today by two outstanding advocates and activists. Amber Hollaby is the founder and former executive director of Queers for Economic Justice. She's worked for decades to counter the myth of gay affluence and for poor and working class LGBTQ people. Welcome, Amber. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Laura.
We're also joined as well by Chris Hayashi, who has served as executive director of the Transgender Law Center since 2015. The center is the largest trans-specific, trans-led organization in the country. Its advocacy and litigation around work, immigration, incarceration, and so much more is setting precedent for the entire U.S. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
I don't know where to begin, really, but why don't I start with you, Chris? This is a lot of forward movement in a relatively short amount of time. Maybe that's why I don't know where to begin. Talk about it. What is happening at this moment? Is it what one friend of mine calls a kind of magic movement moment? What's gone into this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I guess I would start out by saying that, I think the announcement by the Biden-Harris administration about reinstating health care for trans people and LGBT people broadly is an important step forward for sure. However, we can't ignore that announcement was made in the context of a year in which we are seeing an unprecedented level of anti-trans legislation at the state level. And we've been seeing these bills going on a good 6-7 years at this point, starting back in 2015, 16 or so with the so-called bathroom bills that were happening across the country. And it's been the same pretty much every year up until now. And this year there are 33 states with over 100 anti-trans bills. And these bills are specifically targeting transgender young people, basically saying that transgender young people shouldn't be able to play sports like other students and shouldn't be able to have access to the healthcare that we all need, life-saving healthcare. And the fact that that announcement was made in the context of what we're seeing, just an unprecedented level of attack across the country, on top of we continue to see the murders of trans people, specifically Black trans women.
But isn't it, all of that is obviously true, Chris, but isn't it also important for movements like ours to claim some victories along the way?
Absolutely. It's absolutely important. And I think that, for example, you were talking about the repeal of the walking while trans ban bill in New York. Huge, huge step forward.
Yeah.
However, it is a step, and there's just so much more that our communities deserve in order
So
to
let me
fully
come to
live our
you,
lives.
Amber. We will come back. I promise we will get back into everything there
Yeah.
is to be done. I just want a moment of, wow, we actually got some things done. I mean, Amber, to you, it is hard to overstate the discriminatory impact of this walking while trans ban.
Yes.
Talk a bit about who was affected. You worked with them very closely at Queers for Economic Justice. Whose lives are being changed by this and how?
I think it's important to know that the original legislation, the original bill was meant around loitering, was set up to target sex workers, was set up to talk about prostitution without having to say it. So what you did is talk about the fact that people, quote unquote, shouldn't hang out on the street. And then it could be used like the stop and frisk to hit whatever communities you were most targeting in the police force or in any kind of legal activity. And so that was the originator. And I think it's important because queer people of all kinds and or people who are sex workers have often had to live on the streets. I mean, we live where we find ourselves economically. That is the reality of being homeless. It isn't like, oh, well, I don't feel like having an apartment. It's like, oh my God, I live in New York City and I don't have the kind of money it takes to rent somewhere. And so street work of all kinds, both drugs, sex work, and a whole range of quote unquote illegal activities were generated and targeted around loitering. That was the easiest, indiscriminate kind of way. What Chris was talking about, I think, is really fundamental because it is often trans women of color, especially Black and Latino trans women, who are the target of police activity that is unparalleled. And sometimes that is because you're also a sex worker, but it may just be that you're coming home and you get hit.
And when we talk about hit, Chris, I mean, the testimony that people gave in New York and that people have been giving all around the country about what has been happening to them at the hands of the police isn't just being slapped in, cuffs and put in a van. It is abuse of a very graphic kind, a lot of sexual abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, just for those of us who are watching this, perhaps who are not as familiar with the statistics, when Amber connects sex work with being unable to get other kinds of work, what's the data for trans people and employment today?
So the harassment, the abuse, the violence that specifically Black and brown trans women sex workers face at the hands of the police is horrific. I believe the statistic is that 9 out of 10 trans sex workers have faced harassment, violence at the hands of the police. We also know that for trans communities overall, that the poverty rates are astounding. I believe it's 2 times the poverty rate of the general population. Specifically for trans people of color, it's 4 times the poverty rate. Unemployment is huge for the trans community. So the larger picture is that while there's been a level of victories, while there's been an increase in visibility, that trans people in this country, specifically we're talking about Black and brown trans people as well, are continuing to struggle to survive on a daily basis. And this has just gotten worse in this time of COVID-19 and a global pandemic. And the conditions in which people are living and struggling have just gotten so much worse.
One group that continues not to get a whole lot of attention, I think, Amber, is working class trans people
Yes.
and queer people, because we don't have a whole lot of working class people in our culture, period. At least not as the butt of jokes. Talk about the relationship between organized labor, trade unions, what we can think of as, workers and workers' issues, and the LGBTQ issues that you work on.
I think that what Chris was also talking about is the way that different parts of populations disappear, are not ever named, if not in some stereotypical and usually rotten kind of way. And so working class LGBT people is an oxymoron because, as we know, all gay people are rich and most of them are male and they're all white. So, okay, so now we got the perfect gay person. All the rest of us, all the LGBTQs that don't fit that stereotype, fall further and further down the ladder. So we're less and less visible unless we're kind of a joke. So working people, the regular kinds of folks that drive a bus, work in a store, are, live month to month, try and make it manageable, economics manageable in a system that's out of control, capitalism, thank you very much. We're not the ones that are talked about around LGBTQ experience and lives. So the fact that you work at McDonald's and then you go do a blowjob to be able to afford to pay your rent, it's those two forms of labor that you do, not just one. And you're working class in that labor, including sex work. People that do sex work regularly are sex workers and understand themselves that way, whatever they call themselves. But often there's a whole category, I think, particularly in queer communities, trans communities, where you do sex work or sex labor of some kind, and you do it sporadically. You do it because this month you're not going to be able to pay your rent or take care of your kids. I mean, those are the kinds of things that happen. And so while we're not seen as workers, what it means is that then the reality of being transgender, being a lesbian, being a gay man, being bisexual, being queer is never represented, is never understood. And that's what QEJ, Queers for Economic Justice, that I was the ED of and helped start, that's what we took on. Yeah. It's like gay people aren't supposed to be in homeless shelters. LGBT people are not supposed to be in systems that are about poverty and racism. And so we were completely invisible. We weren't invisible when we were riding a subway all night because we didn't have any place to sleep. Then every cop in the city was more than willing to bust us.
You talk about this in your book, My Dangerous Desires. You're not talking theoretical here. No. You're talking your own experience.
And I'm talking my own life. I was a sex worker for a very long time. And it wasn't something that I talked about in a feminist context or even an LGBT. And if I did, the assumption was that it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. It was awful. Oh my God, we're so sorry. Otherwise, we would have never done it. And it's like, I feel like saying to people, you actually don't understand hard work. Because frankly, sometimes sex work was easier than working in a dry cleaning plant with the fumes coming up your nose every day, and you'd get home and you'd throw up and you wouldn't eat because you were sick. So, excuse me, but many of us have been and are now sex workers who are part of our communities, and we're never seen, Laura.
Chris, again, this show is, I think, has got a disproportionately large labor audience, people who are members of trade unions. And I remember in her book, or their book, Stone Butch Blues, Leslie Feinberg, now Les Feinberg, um, talked about the difference being in a union made to their ability to hold down a job. In that case, a blue collar work job. Um, with the challenge that unions face today, and just 6% of workers in private sector employment are member of one, where do trans people go for protection?
The majority of trans people in this country, specifically trans people of color, are really struggling to survive on a daily basis. Like folks' ability to access income, to access housing, healthcare is all super limited. And what we've seen over the past year, to just name, is that there have been relief efforts that have happened, right? And there have not been enough for people all across the country. And what we saw again and again is that trans people were left out, that trans people were forgotten, even in the midst of this global crisis. But what we also saw is that trans leaders all across the country, and I will specifically name Black and Brown trans women and femmes, did what we have always done and made sure that our communities were taken care of. Folks organized in their communities locally to get food, to make sure people had housing, to make sure people had access to protective gear, because no one else was going to do it for us. And we saw that again and again. So groups like Brave Space Alliance in Chicago, the Transgender Intersex Justice Project here in the Bay Area, like literally going out into the streets and making sure that Black trans women and femmes, like Black trans sex workers in San Francisco, had a place to stay in the midst of a global pandemic because no one else was doing it.
There's the forgetting, there's also the remembering. And I just have a question for you, Amber. You know, the Trump administration and many of its spawn out there statewide seem constantly to remember trans people.
Yes.
And carefully to carve out of protection and provision of care people who they perceive as trans. Can you speak to what you have come to understand about that? Like, why are they so, for lack of a better word, obsessed?
They are obsessed. I mean, and I actually think it's about attacking the most vulnerable and the queer people that make you the most nervous. The ones that, the people in our communities that are least protected inside our own communities are often the least valued, even internally in the LGBT configurations, but also the folks that you think externally will make whatever transphobic, homophobic, racist legislation you're going to try and pull off the easiest to talk about, like Chris was saying. So, ooh, let's be scared about the bathroom. Oh my God, let's do a gender check before you can use the bathroom, you know, etc. We've seen it over and over again, which is why the loitering law was so useful, because you didn't have to name who it was you were going after. You just had to say the activity that made them vulnerable. So I think trans folks have been considered an easy target that a middle-class heterosexual community would be frightened of. But it also is important to note that it's often been trans femmes, often, who have been leadership in the opposition to those kinds of things and the broader perspectives that are used to attack our communities. Make the road by walking, doing other kinds of organizing work. Its leadership has often been trans embedded. And it's important, I think, to say that, especially, this is my dream. If I could help build organizing union organizing attempts that included a conversation about sex work so that you would talk about what it meant when you worked at Target and then you went home and did sex work because you weren't paid enough to be able to make it on a full-time job. It would be my dream to be able to help build a union movement that honored sex work and understood that sex work in a variety of ways is the component of how a constructed economic life gets put together in this time and age, in a pandemic, in a time when there are not jobs for many, many, many people. If you're going to do a union organizing job, then you better talk about the way people survive in order to know how to organize them.
Yeah.
And if you go to a union meeting and you're afraid to say that on your way, you did a blowjob for somebody to make it economically possible for you to get home, that's not a good union meeting that you can't say that in
Yeah.
and not be made tragic rather than economically vulnerable. And so I think
I hear a course at the School of Labor and Urban Studies right here, right now,
that's right.
being born.
And
How
it
about it,
should.
people?
It
Chris,
really should. And Chris and I have talked about this. I mean, this, Laura, is, if we're on a show that's about economics and we're talking about queer people and Pride Month, then let's talk about what it means to be economically terrified about both your identity in terms of whether you can apply for a job and be taken seriously, and your ability to bring in an income that will support you. And if we don't talk about that, we're not talking about labor and desire and sex work and transgender of color. We're not talking about the reality of how a majority of LGBTQ people live. It's a majority of us that need to be captured, not a minority of us. This is how
that
most
whole
of us
one for all for
survive.
one idea requires that you don't have vulnerable flanks that can be,
That's right.
encroached upon. Chris, I just want to quickly touch on the work you're doing around immigration, because we haven't talked about that in this context.
Right.
But that remains an enormous challenge in this administration, even as we do talk about what victories perhaps we can claim. But immigration and trans identity, nasty mix given this country's policies these days.
Absolutely. I do want to, though, add on to what Amber was talking about and the question you asked, because it's absolutely something that I think a lot about in terms of the attacks that are happening against trans communities that were happening under Trump, before Trump, and are happening now. And I think that there's a number of different things to raise up. So one, that a lot of the attacks against trans people, they're not just attacks on trans people, right? They're attacks on how all of us express and see our gender, which is for everyone, right? There are also attempts to just increase the ways in which people can be criminalized and using trans people as a target. And there's a level of clear attack, and this speaks to what Amber was just talking about, in terms of our ability to control our bodies, right? Like, we should all have control over our bodies. And ultimately, a lot of these laws and these attacks are trying to limit and decrease the control that we all have over our bodies. And the last thing I just want to say on this is I also think that what we're seeing now with these attacks, particularly at the state level, is that these politicians are trying to deflect attention from their absolute failure during this time of a global pandemic to make sure that we all have what we need to live and survive and thrive. So, and also to what Amber was saying about attacking the most vulnerable, I think we just have to name that part of what has made that true is because there has been a historic and ongoing neglect by the larger LGBT movement, by broader social justice movements, of trans communities and leaders who have always been fighting for our rights and communities, often without recognition or support. So just had to say that. But in terms of trans folks and immigration, So absolutely. I mean, we know that trans immigrants in detention face horrific violence, harassment, and discrimination. We know that. Like, we can just point to the fact that in the last few years, two trans women, Roxana Hernandez and Joanna Medina, were murdered in ICE detention. TLC actually has a class action lawsuit on behalf of Roxana Hernandez and her family. So we know that trans migrants face just horrific violence in detention. And what we also know is that trans immigrant leaders all across the country have been calling for years for an end to trans detention, for an end to detaining trans people as a vulnerable population, for ultimately an end to detaining everyone, and to abolish ICE. And what we're seeing now is that the Biden administration has an opportunity. They could end trans detention today. And we are calling on them to do so, and we are just waiting.
Chris, Amber, I'm sorry we don't have another 3 hours to continue this conversation. It's been really great. Have a fantastic Pride. Out there, if you have questions, comments, you want to write to us, you can. cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. We'd like to hear from you. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders.